Hello and welcome to Midday Report here on TVP World. I'm your host, Marie Cato. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Donald Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner are in Moscow on Tuesday to meet Vladimir Putin for talks on a possible way to end Russia's war in Ukraine. We now go live to our correspondent in Ukraine, Katerji, to give us the latest on these developments. Good afternoon, Oz. What do we know so far and what is the mood?
Well, look, if it feels like deja vu, it should do, because yet another visit by Steve Witkoff to Moscow. And in all of these visits, he has not been able to achieve any kind of tangible concessions from Moscow. This time he's heading to Moscow to hand over that updated draft proposal for a peace plan. This initial proposal was rejected. That 28-point peace proposal was rejected by Kyiv and by European leaders for giving away Ukrainian land, something the Ukrainians consider to be total red lines. So they revised the draft with negotiations between Europeans and the Ukrainians. And now the Americans are taking this updated proposal to Russia for Vladimir Putin. Now, Putin himself has recently given a speech in which he signaled that he wasn't prepared to make any concessions to the Ukrainians in order to achieve peace, and signaled that he was willing to carry on fighting until Russia met its objectives. So it's unclear if there's going to be any success from these talks. Certainly, there isn't a lot of enthusiasm in Kyiv that we're heading towards some kind of conclusion. And whenever we've heard from Kremlin spokespeople, they haven't sounded like they were heading or seeing that we were heading to some sort of conclusion. But nevertheless, the negotiations and diplomacy continue regardless. President Zelensky himself has spoken. He said that there are further discussions between Washington and Kyiv about safeguards for Ukraine from the kinds of Russian aerial strikes that we've been seeing over the last few weeks, devastating Ukraine's energy infrastructure and killing scores of civilians as residential buildings have been targeted all across the country. Ternopil, Kyiv, all across the country, civilians being killed in these Russian attacks. So no further details given by Zelensky about what those safeguards may be. He did say that Ukraine was still committed to achieving a real peace and guaranteed security. However, there is no indication from the Ukrainians that they feel that they are necessarily heading towards that, although they are being positive about the US role in these mediations. All eyes on Moscow now to see how Putin responds to this updated peace proposal. We haven't seen the official peace proposal yet from the United States, so we'll see how Moscow responds. But if Putin's words in recent days have been any indication, we don't think that the Russians are about to accept some of these proposals. Those are red lines for Russia, just as there were red lines for Kyiv, such as withdrawing from Donetsk and Luhansk, areas that Russia hasn't been able to conquer in many, many years of war. The Ukrainians saying that they were not going to withdraw from those territories. So we are still basically at the first starting point for these discussions. We have still not heard from the Russians what they are willing to accept or not. So there isn't a lot of faith really here in Kyiv that we are heading for any kind of conclusion. However, the Ukrainians are definitely sounding positive in the way they are discussing these negotiations with the United States. They definitely want Donald Trump to stay invested in trying to bring about some kind of conclusion. But the difficulties really are laid bare when you hear Putin talk about not wanting to concede anything and being willing to fight on regardless. So these are very, very difficult negotiations indeed that Kushner, Donald Trump's son-in-law, and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff are heading to Moscow to discuss. And we'll keep you updated on any developments that come through right here on TVP World.
Thanks very much. That was Katerji joining us from Kyiv. Ukraine still controls part of the Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region despite Russian claims of full control. The Ukrainian army has denied reports of the city's capture.
Ukraine still controls part of Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region despite Russian claims of the full control. The Ukrainian army has denied reports of the city's capture.
Ukrainian soldiers are holding their positions in the northern part of the strategic city of Pokrovsk in eastern Ukraine. Ukrainian forces killed 1,221 Russian soldiers and wounded 545 in the Pokrovsk area in November 2025. In particular, 519 were killed and 131 wounded within the city itself.
The seizure of Pokrovsk in eastern Ukraine is of strategic importance for the Russian leadership. Above all, it would allow Moscow to advance its broader war objectives after a prolonged battle for control over the city that began in mid-2024. Russia's aim is to seize the entire Donbas region. Ukraine still holds about 10% of the territory, but Moscow is demanding Kyiv surrenders these areas as a part of any peace deal. In Kyiv, people do not believe Russian claims that the whole city has been captured, but they understand that any shift on the battlefield could influence the course of peace negotiations.
I think this is being stirred up ahead of the negotiations that are supposed to happen, and therefore the information is most likely not true.
In my opinion, maybe it's not true, because earlier there was similar information that they had already captured Pokrovsk, that there was the fog of war, that they had already entered there. I think that we are still holding our defense there. I think, of course, maybe if they capture Pokrovsk, if that really happens, then they will be pushing Ukraine further, continuing their advance.
U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff is set to meet Putin in Moscow on Tuesday. Moscow could use the capture of Pokrovsk to push the narrative that its taking of Donbas is an inevitability, increasing the pressure on Ukraine to accept its demands.
And now we're going to go live to Brussels, where we're going to go to a press conference that is being delivered by NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. So tomorrow, the foreign ministers of the NATO countries will be meeting to discuss the war in Ukraine and the defense needs of Ukraine. And this is a pre-meeting press conference. So we're going live there to see what Mark Rutte has to say.
And part of Eastern Sentry is, and this is to your specific to your question, is to make sure we will get better and better at tackling the drone threat, both by drone production ourselves and making sure that we have our hands on the latest technology, but also when it comes to anti-drone technology. So that is an integral part of Eastern Sentry, and I can assure you we are progressing rapidly, and this is important, with help, for example, from Ukraine, through our JTEC Joint Center in Poland, where we basically share all the lessons learned also by Ukraine, specifically when it comes to drones, of course, but also generally in this terrible war of aggression started by the Russians.
Okay, fourth row in the very center, Interfax Ukraine.
Hi. Good afternoon.
Goedemiddag.
Goedemiddag zelf.
Jazeker, why not? So the question is, as Mr. Witkoff right now is in Moscow and negotiation regarding US-led peace plan for Ukraine is still under negotiation, we all know that old version of 28 points also include NATO. Like Ukraine has to give up his ambition to become a member of NATO and so on and so on. You know what I'm talking about. In her speech, President Ursula von der Leyen already said nothing about NATO without NATO. So I would like to know what is your opinion on this. Do you foresee that NATO will step up in this negotiation and when? Thank you.
Well, when it comes to the NATO elements, obviously, when it comes to the NATO elements of a deal to end the war against Ukraine, that will be dealt with separately, and that obviously will include NATO. And when it comes to your general comment, I think it is very good that the US has putting forward proposals. You need to start somewhere. You need to have proposals on the table. As you know, both in Geneva and 2 days ago in Miami, talks have been taking place with the Ukrainian side. Indeed, talks today with the Russian side. So we follow that closely, and I think it's really important that the US is leading these efforts, making sure that we do whatever we can to end this terrible war.
All right, coming over here, fourth row on the end, R&D.
Thank you very much. Here I am, over there.
Hi.
Sven Christian Schulz with German Newspaper Network R&D. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov announced that Russia wants to use the peace negotiations to achieve its goal in the war against Ukraine. So do you want to see Russia, instead of Ukraine, making significant concessions instead of demanding the maximum here?
Well, obviously we want the war to end, but with a sovereign Ukraine and a situation where Russia will never ever try again to attack Ukraine. That's key. The talks are now underway. I've stopped years ago to comment on Lavrov, on Putin, or on Peskov. I've met them all in the past as Prime Minister of the Netherlands, and I can assure you, let them talk and not always react.
All right, and just next to him, AFP.
Yes, thank you. Martin Anton for AFP. Coming back to the NATO membership of Ukraine, which was Ukraine not being a member of NATO was part of the original US plan, as far as we know. And even though it's not in the latest proposal, does the Ukrainian NATO membership remain a bargaining chip in the negotiations with Russia? And is the absence of US Secretary of State Rubio tomorrow a sign for the relevance of NATO in this process?
Well, starting with your second question, Marco Rubio is very much involved, of course, in all of this when it comes to ending the war in Ukraine. You've seen him chairing the meetings in Geneva and in Miami. I've been, and the teams are in constant contact. I personally am in constant contact with him. So he's working extremely hard, having to take care not only of the situation in Ukraine, but of course many other issues which are on his plate. So I totally accept him not being able to be here tomorrow, and I would not read anything in it. We will have Deputy Secretary Chris Lendau here. I'm very happy he is here. So I think that's all covered. When it comes to your question on the 28-point plan, I mean, we have moved on. The 28-point plan was this original plan. I think all these negotiations always start with an initial draft. Otherwise, you cannot start the process. But we have moved on. We have had, as I said, and you know, Geneva. We have had the meeting in Miami. And of course, today talks taking place in Russia. This specific question on membership of NATO for Ukraine, I think it's important to maybe separate the principle from the practical. The practical situation is, as you know, that there is consensus required by all allies for Ukraine to join NATO. And right now, as you know, there is no consensus on Ukraine joining NATO. When it comes to the principle, that's the Washington Treaty in 1949. And that Washington Treaty still stands, and also what we decided in the Washington Summit in 2024.
Okay, we'll go to just behind the riser, first row.
Thomas Kutschka with Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
We've seen a number of attacks recently, hybrid attacks, that have been directly attributed to Russia, including the incident in Poland. How do you think NATO should respond to this? How can NATO deter Russia from future attacks like this on NATO soil? And do you agree with what the chairman of the military committee just said, that NATO nations need to become more aggressive in countering these hybrid activities, so basically hitting back?
Well, first of all, let's agree that NATO was founded as a defensive alliance, and of course that is not going to change. But having said that, we should at the same time have no doubt that we can and will ensure our security, whether the threats we face are conventional or these threats are hybrid. And that's one of the reasons why the leaders, when we came together in The Hague, agreed on a revised hybrid strategy. Because we know this is the reality of today. Hybrid and cyber, they are the realities of today, and we have to confront them. Of course, we cannot always tell you exactly what we do, but you know the strategy, and we will keep continuing, making sure that we are safe.
Okay, we'll come over here.
Marco Rutte answering all sorts of very interesting questions and referencing also the hybrid sabotage attack on Poland's railway network. That's a wrap for Midday Report. Thank you so much for joining us, and stay tuned for much more on TVP World. Goodbye.